Night had fallen over Uruk, and torchlight flickered against mud-brick walls as a scribe leaned over a damp clay tablet. A reed stylus bit into the surface, sign after careful sign, to track barley deliveries from nearby villages. Around this quiet act stretched a city without precedent. Intersecting alleys, crowded courtyards, and workshops clustered behind fortifications that tradition later credited to Gilgamesh, enclosing tens of thousands within a single planned space. From above, the alluvial plain had appeared carved into rectangles by canals and irrigation ditches, drawing the Euphrates into a delicate web that fed fields and orchards. Smoke rose from kilns and metalworking hearths, drifting past the towering platform of the White Temple and the sacred precinct of Eanna. Archaeological reconstructions showed terraces, columned halls, and processional routes, hinting at a scale of coordination and labor unlike anything in earlier village societies. Yet this dense urban experiment stood on fragile ground. Unpredictable floods, salinizing soils, drought, and the constant threat of disease made southern Mesopotamia a risky place to pack so many people together. Excavated houses differed sharply in size, and distinct craft quarters and imported luxury goods pointed to elites who commanded surplus. By the logic of subsistence, Uruk seemed a dangerous miscalculation, yet it expanded, endured, and redefined what human communities could be. The film shifted back several millennia to the broad Mesopotamian plains between about 9,000 and 7,000 BCE. There, no ziggurats or city walls rose from the earth, only scattered hamlets tucked beside stands of wild wheat and barley. Small groups harvested with flint sickles, their movements still partly seasonal as they tracked game, water, and ripening plants. Grain disappeared into pit silos and baskets, anchoring people to favored spots without yet creating anything like a city. Archaeological sites such as Jerf el Ahmar and Abu Huraira revealed what this early sedentism had looked like. Excavations uncovered modest houses clustered around shared spaces, grinding stones worn smooth by countless hours of processing grain, and traces of plant tending that preceded full-scale agriculture. Yet there were no palaces, no monumental temples, no clear ruling quarter. Human remains suggested varied diets and often better overall health than skeletons from later crowded urban neighborhoods. The camera then moved to central Anatolia around 7000 BCE, gliding over the dense mud-brick mass of Çatalhöyük. Roofs touched rooftops, forming a continuous surface where people walked, entered houses by ladders, and navigated a town without streets. It appeared as an aggregation of households rather than a state. No grand palace, no towering temple, no obvious administrative center. This raised a puzzle. If people sustained such complex, clustered communities, why had true cities with kings and bureaucracies emerged at all? The camera descended over southern Mesopotamia as it had looked between 4000 and 3500 BCE, where the Tigris and Euphrates spread into a shifting lacework of channels and marshes. Around the early centers, later known as Uruk, Eridu, and Nippur, archaeologists had traced ghostly canal lines across the plain, revealing how early builders cut, straightened, and rerouted watercourses. What had once been a volatile wetland became an engineered landscape of levees, dikes, and irrigation basins. Sediment cores and clay models, laid out under laboratory lights, told the cost of this transformation. Layer by layer, salts had accumulated in the irrigated fields drawn upward by the sun and trapped by constant watering. Over decades, yields of wheat and other crops declined, and more salt-tolerant barley increasingly dominated the record. The very irrigation that supported dense populations also poisoned the soil beneath them, eroding the grain surpluses that sustained the first cities. Reconstructed shadufs and canal gates showed how much daily labor had been needed simply to keep the system functioning. Canals silted and had to be dredged, embankments cracked and required repair, and floodwaters demanded constant vigilance. A failed inundation, a breached levee, or a season of neglected maintenance could have starved a city. Yet temple platforms rose higher and palatial compounds expanded, drawing in more labor and fields, even as smaller upstream villages remained safer and more flexible. The camera moved past stone thresholds into the dim interior of a late Uruk period temple, somewhere around 3300 to 3000 BCE. Storerooms stretched away in tight corridors, stacked with jars of grain, bales of wool, and hanging animal carcasses. At low tables, priests and administrators pressed reed styli into damp clay, tallying incoming deliveries. The temple appeared less as a sanctuary than as the throbbing heart of a vast accounting system. Artifacts from Uruk and Jemdet Nasr laid bare how this system worked. Standardized bevel rim bowls, mass-produced and nearly identical, suggested measured rations rather than private meals. Seal impressions, rolled across clay jar stoppers, recorded shipments and guaranteed their integrity. Early numeric tablets filled with signs for grain, oil, and livestock documented quotas and outputs. The city seemed to operate as a machine for extraction and control, not merely as a crowded settlement. Archaeological reconstructions showed temples owning broad fields and orchards, while workshops housed textile workers, metal workers, and brewers whose products flowed into central magazines. At sites like Tel Brak in northern Mesopotamia, similar storage areas and elite quarters pointed to a shared model of concentrated power. Many inhabitants received rations instead of farming their own plots, bound to an institution that had to function flawlessly. Efficient, yet brittle, these overclocked redistribution hubs balanced constantly on the edge of failure. The camera lingered on the damp surface of a clay tablet from Uruk, as the wedge-shaped impressions of a reed stylus came into focus. These proto-cuneiform signs, dating to the late 4th millennium BCE, recorded no myths or hymns, but deliveries of barley, labor quotas, and rations of beer. At nearby Susa, similar tablets documented herds, storerooms, and officials. Writing, in its earliest known form, functioned as accounting, an instrument of survival for swollen institutions. Animations peeled back time to show how simple pictographs for jars, grain, and animals gradually shifted into abstract signs and numerical systems. Tokens, tallies, and bulli that once tracked goods were replaced by standardized impressions on clay, allowing vast temple households and palatial estates to follow resources they could no longer see directly. Cylinder seals rolled intricate scenes across wet tablets, turning a personal emblem into a signature and a rolled image into a binding mark of obligation and identity. Across the desert, in pre-dynastic and early dynastic Egypt, labels from Hierakonpolis and Abydos carried some of the earliest hieroglyphs, royal names, estates, tallies of offerings. Ceremonial palettes and tags from tombs showed that power there, too, relied on inscribed control over people and things. Writing appeared as a technology to render distance manageable. Cities created unprecedented problems of scale. Logistics, taxation, labor management, and scripts emerged as emergency tools that kept these fragile urban experiments from tearing themselves apart. The camera moved east, following the arc of ancient river systems into the Indus Valley around 2600 BCE. From above, Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, and Dholavira appeared as gridded puzzles. Straight streets intersected at right angles, and whole neighborhoods repeated modular patterns. Archaeologists had traced the same brick proportions from city to city, a uniform rhythm of baked clay that hinted at shared standards. Yet, unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, no towering temple or palace clearly ruled the skyline. Instead, the reconstructions lingered on other kinds of monuments. A vast public bath dominated the citadel mound at Mohenjo-Daro, its watertight bricks and stairs suggesting ritual or civic gatherings. Massive platforms and rows of storage rooms had been interpreted as granaries, while broad halls could have hosted assemblies. Streets carried covered drains fed by household bathing areas and wells set neatly into courtyards. The engineering felt meticulous, but signs of a king's residence or royal tomb remained stubbornly absent. Seals bearing the so-called unicorn figure, tiny stone weights measured in precise ratios, and the same brick dimensions spread across hundreds of kilometers all implied coordination. The script on those seals stayed undeciphered, leaving no agreed list of rulers, no royal boasts, only mute symbols. The cities seemed like anonymous machines, dense, ordered, and tied to fragile rivers and monsoon cycles, yet not overtly ruled by visible warlords. If such different political forms created cities, some deeper force clearly pushed humans toward these risky, resource-hungry urban experiments. The camera passed over wind-scoured mounds at Tel Brak, Uruk, and Mohenjo-Daro. then overlaid ghostly reconstructions of crowded streets and canals. The narration turned to a darker rhythm. In southern Mesopotamia, by the late 3rd millennium BCE, cuneiform tablets recorded fields whitening with salt, shrinking harvests, and hunger. Archaeologists traced a clear shift from wheat to more salt-tolerant barley, followed in some areas by thinning populations and the quiet abandonment of once thriving quarters. Over images of broken ziggurat terraces and eroded city walls, the narration evoked the Widener Chronicle and Sumerian city laments. They spoke of Ur, Nippur, and other centers laid low by what scribes described as divine wrath, invading armies, and desertion. Clay tablets listed emptied houses, silent markets, and neglected temples. Archaeological layers of ash, rubble, and later poorer construction echoed those texts, revealing cities that never fully recovered their former scale or complexity. The scene shifted east to the Indus region, where Mohenjo-Daro and other core cities of the Indus civilization faded after about 1900 BCE. Excavations showed crumbling drains, silted streets, and bricks reused in makeshift walls, while paleo-environmental studies indicated changing river regimes, including the drying or shifting of the Gagar-Hakra system. As long-distance trade waned and urban planning frayed, these cities shrank or were deserted, exposing how vulnerable early urban experiments had been to climate, economy, and politics. The story of the first cities rewound to reveal the human bodies that bore their costs. At sites such as Ur, Abydos, and Mohenjo-Daro, bioarchaeologists read bones like archives. Crowded brick houses and narrow lanes had left traces of chronic infection, respiratory disease, and nutritional stress. Compared to some surrounding rural cemeteries, urban skeletons more often showed stunted growth, worn joints, and healed fractures that spoke of dense living and relentless labor. Reconstructed streets of Mesopotamian and Egyptian cities showed why. Houses pressed wall to wall, open drains ran beside doorways, and animal pens stood close to sleeping spaces, conditions ideal for spreading pathogens. In nearby cemeteries, death reflected inequality. Royal graves at Ur glittered with gold, lapis lazuli, and weapons, while Egyptian mastabas and pyramids rose over elites. In their shadow lay simple pit burials with few offerings for common laborers and servants. Stone and clay recorded the social order that held these populations in place. The laws of Ur-Nama and the Code of Hammurabi laid out harsh penalties, debt bondage, and rigid ranks separating free, dependent, and enslaved people. Corvée labor on canals, temple estates, and monumental projects bound households to urban authorities. Yet cities also offered walls against raiders, specialized crafts, markets, and powerful temples, making them magnets despite the dangers and inequalities they intensified. As millennia passed, cities no longer appeared as isolated experiments on distant rivers. They formed a visible pattern that extended across continents. Animated maps traced dense clusters along the Tigris and Euphrates, where Uruk, Ur, and later Babylon rose, and along the Nile, where Memphis and Thebes anchored pharaonic power. In the Indus Valley, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa added their gridded streets and brick platforms to this growing, interconnected urban tapestry. Far to the east, new centers emerged along the Yellow River. At Erlitou, archaeologists uncovered rammed earth foundations, elite compounds, and bronze workshops that suggested a nascent court society. At Yinshu, the later Shang capital near Anyang, massive walls, palatial enclosures, and industrial-scale bronze foundries revealed another version of the same urban formula: concentrated authority, specialized labor, and voracious demand for resources drawn from an increasingly organized countryside. Trade routes, once tenuous, became the veins that fed these cities. Copper from Oman reached workshops in Mesopotamia. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan glittered in royal tombs at Ur and in Egyptian burials. Later, circuits across the eastern Mediterranean tied palace economies together. As some regions adopted cities, neighbors felt pressure to match their military and bureaucratic scale or be absorbed. City-states and early kingdoms competed, conquered, and replaced failed centers, making urban life the enduring framework of power. As the sun lowered over the mounds of Uruk, the camera traced eroded bricks where avenues and temples had once crowded together. The narration recalled that, by strict survival measures, such cities had been terrible bets. Crowded disease pools, fragile irrigation webs, and chronic dependence on distant fields. Yet in these risky concentrations of people, clay tablets first carried written words, and bureaucrats recorded rations, contracts, and royal decrees that reshaped human relations. The film then moved between artifacts and skylines. Indus seals, Egyptian hieroglyphic inscriptions, and Mesopotamian law codes appeared against silhouettes of highways and towers. It emphasized how these earliest urban experiments had already assembled the familiar toolkit of dense infrastructure, social inequality, and astonishing creative power. Monumental temples, walled precincts, organized priesthoods, standing armies, and complex trade routes all emerged from environments that, on paper, should have failed and dispersed. Finally, the story widened to later antiquity. Capitals such as Nineveh, Babylon, Thebes, Alexandria, and Rome inherited and amplified the same contradictions first visible in Uruk, Mohenjo-Daro, and Memphis. Empires rose and fell. Canals silted up and granaries emptied, yet new cities rose atop old ruins. The chapter ended by asking why humanity persisted with this dangerous social form, whose improbable survival had set the long trajectory toward today's overwhelmingly urban world.